So I am very excited. I'm going to stand over here so that I can point to it. So I'm very excited today to, come on in those seats. I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Al Powers as our speaker today. So Al is at Yale, where he has a joint appointment in psychiatry and psychology. And I'm going to make sure I say this correctly so I have it in my pocket. He's also the medical director and associate director of the Prime Psychosis Risk Clinic. I'm hosting Al here today, and if you know me, you might be thinking to yourself, why would Penella be hosting somebody who's running a psychosis clinic like this? Makes no sense. But I'll tell you how I came to meet Al in the first place. So for years I had this sort of pet theory of mine, and I even got so far as I got a pilot grant to collect data, and it's motivated by my predictions from a Bayesian framework, and it's about, I thought there might be some conditions where people don't use priors. And then I go to, the other thing I do is mathematical psychology, so I go to the Society for Mathematical Psychology's satellite conference at Psychonomics, and this invited guy, is giving this talk where he makes the exact opposite prediction of what I just got a pilot grant for. And I'm like, what is this all about? So I went up, I cornered Al afterwards at the coffee, and I'm like, how could you be making those predictions? But Al had a rigorous framework, really clear predictions, ideas for why it might be that he makes one prediction and I make another prediction. And so this is what I really appreciate about his work. He does behavioral, computational modeling, has really rigorous methods, and is always asking really interesting theoretical questions. And so I'm delighted for Al to be here today to tell us about his work.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, and also just for the wonderful hospitality that I've received since I've been here. This has been a wonderful, wonderful visit, and I've met so many super well-prepared students in particular. Unbelievable conversation. I feel like we came up with 4 grant ideas just at lunch, so I appreciate you guys doing your homework and thinking about the ideas and coming with all the energy and enthusiasm you can muster. So thank you very much for that. This is wonderful. So thank you so much for having me. I'm going to be talking to you today about pretty much the things I've been obsessing over myself. I'm going to let you into the chaos that is my mind for over the last 5 years or so since I talked to Brunella at that meeting, and trying to get at how we can use Bayesian frameworks and computational frameworks in general to understand the thing that I particularly care about. I'm a psychiatrist as well as a neuroscientist, and I really care about where a psychiatric disease comes from. And the question that we have is, how can we use the frameworks that we have adopted to better kind of answer the question as to where they come from and how can we better treat them? So we'll start with a little bit of an outline, I think. About it, we're starting broadly. Medical nosology, which is not the study of noses. It is the study of how we understand medical disease states. And then we'll move on to how we might understand a psychiatric nosology that is kind of based upon the same ideas. And we'll use as an example on my favorite symptom of psychosis, which is auditory hallucinations. And then broaden beyond that to think about how what we've learned from auditory hallucinations might kind of tell us more about how we can dig more deeply into the distal causes of psychiatric illness. So medical nosology. Some of you have medical backgrounds, I know, and so I might pick on some of you to be able to tell me what this is. Yeah, who said that? Yeah, there you go. It is a manifestation of jaundice. Yes, exactly right. It is technically called scleral icterus because it happens in the sclera, the white part of the eye. It makes it yellow, icterus. And so, yeah, it's a yellow eyeball. Why do I care? Because this seems to, we care in the first place because people show up to the clinic with this sign. So my eyes are yellow, or I notice it, right? And we also know something about where it comes from. And that's the critical piece here, right? So we know that the yellowness in the eyeball is pretty much bilirubin. It's this stuff right here, right? And we know something about bilirubin's metabolism. We know that it comes from increased breakdown of blood products, like red blood cells, right? It also is processed by the liver. And it also gets excreted from the body from the gallbladder, right? So stuff that impacts these organ systems can cause bilirubin to build up in the blood and cause you to have a yellow eyeball, right? So we have this kind of like causal framework for understanding where this stuff comes from, right? And so, disruptions in any of these organ systems can do that, right? And we know what those disruptions look like on the distal side of things, right? So we know, for example, that infection in the liver, hepatitis, or infection in the gallbladder could potentially cause disruptions such that it's not getting rid of the way it should be, and so we have increased bilirubin buildup. We have physical obstruction, like a gallstone, can potentially cause that, as we've discussed, and then also autoimmune disease causing inflammation in these systems also can cause it. And the nice thing about knowing this causal tree is that you can not treat this. Yeah, you can do things that impact this, right? But we're treating down here, right? We're treating the infection, we're treating the physical obstruction, we're treating the autoimmune disorder, such that you see an improvement in symptomatology, right? That's what we do. We treat the distal causes of disease. We got to know them first, right? This is kind of generally what we think is going on in psychiatric disease at the moment, right? So we have signs and symptoms, we're pretty good at that. We know all sorts of stuff about what they look like, what the phenomenology of them are, whether they develop generally during the course of their lifespan. We know lots of stuff about that. We also know generally stuff that seems to contribute, right? So we know like generally neurotransmitter derangements, like probably psychosis got something to do with dopamine, because dopaminergic drugs for the last 60 years have been used to treat psychotic symptoms, right? So it probably has something to do with dopamine. We also know that, from symptom capture studies, for example, there's circuit dysfunction that seems to go with psychotic symptoms broadly. And we also know that there's certain genetic susceptibilities, like the 3q29 deletion syndrome, for example, Dr. Muley, may potentially contribute to the development of psychosis as well. But there's, and in the middle, there's like something, right? There's model parameters that kind of are altered such that those then cause the signs and symptoms we are seeing, right? And so if you look at that in a particular case, so hallucinations, this is a painting that was done by one of my participants that's called Seeing with the Ear. This is someone who had multimodal hallucinations. We know what generally hallucinations look like, what they sound like, where they come from, and space, and all this other stuff. We also know from work from folks like Ralph Hoffman and Michelle Hampson at Yale and others who did stuff even before that with SPECT, which parts of the brain seem to be active when people are hearing voices actively. So we know kind of what the circuit dysfunction looks like, but then in between, we got a question mark, right? We don't really quite understand how those things really translate across these levels of description, right? And the thing that we'd like to be able to understand then is how, just like we did with the liver and the gallbladder and the blood products, we want to understand how typical physiology, typical processing, in this case is the brain, we're talking about information processing, how typical information processing gets changed to produce the symptoms, right? And so for hallucinations, actually, that's a pretty easy one to get a foothold in, because it's perception, right? And the nice thing about studying perception, as many of you do, is that you can kind of control it a little bit. You can do some kind of experimental manipulations to see exactly how people are perceiving things and what impacts how they're perceiving things. And so we can start with this framework for understanding perception in general, which is seeing perception as this process of unconscious inference. This is a Helmholtz quote, which is the idea that this is not perception is not this passive reception of inputs. It's not like a movie where light hits your retina or sound hits your cochlea, and it gets passed over the processing hierarchy in this feed-forward pattern, and that's it. You can receive it and you use it somehow, right? It's instead kind of this active process of building an internal model of what's around you, what the causes of your sensations are. And that's inherently a Bayesian process. So what we're looking at really is this kind of forward model and backward model, right? So we have these this neuronal activity that we're using to interpret some environmental state X, right? That's really what this is, what we're doing. So what we're doing is translating back and forth between the causes of our sensory inputs and the activity that arises from those inputs, and then going backward and trying to infer the causes of those inputs using those that activity. There are probably a couple seats here, guys. You can filter on in. Come on down. And if you want to do it in an even more kind of graphically oriented way, you can write it out as essentially Bayes' theorem, which is what this is. But you'd also, in the graphical sense, you can talk about how these things are related by breaking it down to the prior, which is your existing model or expectations about the world, the likelihood, which is new information about the world, and then that is used to develop a posterior here. You'll notice that this what we're looking at is a prior and a likelihood, and they have different, not just means, but also variances here. That variance, or the inverse variance, is something we'll call precision, which is just the mathematical term for that. So when I talk about precision, it doesn't necessarily imply how good the information is, but does pertain to the reliability or the weighting of that information. So we have different means and different precisions of those two sources of information, that then eventually you can come to the conclusion with a posterior of what actually happened. So what I'm saying is that perception really is this weighted process, this process of weighting those two sources of information, your existing knowledge about the environment and new information, to come to a conclusion about what's actually around you. So if you think about that, right, if this is how perception works, then you can kind of then generalize it to hallucinations, right? So hallucinations are percepts in the absence of external information, right? So if that's true, and you're coming to the conclusion, this posterior, that something is around you and that's not borne out by corresponding sensory evidence, what that would mean is that perhaps you're over-trusting your expectations, your priors about the world, compared to new evidence, right? So the question is, do hallucinations actually arise from overly precise or overweighted priors? So that would look like this, essentially. So here, the prior, the likelihood, and the posterior is, if you have hyper-precise priors, is the posterior just kind of sucked over to the prior side of things, and then you perceive that. And so the question and the test that kind of arises from that is, can you create hallucinations then by making people overweight their expectations, overweight their priors? And so in asking this question, we came across this really interesting old literature. This is a paper that was published by Carl Seashore in 1895 in the Proceedings of the Yale Psychological Laboratory. And what Dr. Seashore did was this really interesting experiment where he had people come into the lab and he had them do a hearing test. That's how he couched it. And you would sit down in front of the experimenter, who would be behind a kind of a curtain, and you'd be listening for a tone. You had to press a button when you hear the tone. And the experimenter would kind of ramp up the volume of the tone very slowly, right? Eventually you'd perceive it, you'd press the button, right? And you'd hold it down for as long as you're perceiving it, right? And then the experimenter would leave it at that threshold level for a little bit of time, and then ramp it back down, and your job is to take your finger off the button when you stop hearing, right? So that's one trial, it's like 19 seconds long, right? And so you do this over and over again, right? But the key part of this is that you would know that the tone might be coming up because there's this ready light that gets lit, right? So there's this like little green light, and then maybe you'll hear the tone, maybe not, right? You do it over and over and over again. About 60 or 90 trials later, people start reporting hearing the tone, even when the tone is not being presented. And they do so with similar latency of response, as if the tone were actually there, similar duration of response, similar confidence that the tone actually was there. And so what Seashore concluded was that what he was doing was using this newfangled thing that Pavlov had just described, called classical. It wasn't classical at the time, I guess. It was just conditioning to instantiate this belief or this expectation about the world, and then from that he was creating a percept. Which, of course, there are lots of different reasons to maybe call that into question. Like, there are lots of demand characteristics to this task. You're like sitting there in front of the person asking, like, did you hear it yet? Lots of different reasons to think perhaps this is maybe like a response bias and not necessarily corresponding to a percept necessarily. But nonetheless, this paradigm came up, again, 1995, and it came back in the 30s when another man named Doug Elson kind of did this as well and did all sorts of different variations, and in the visual realm as well. Actually, it was really interesting. There's this is kind of a little bit of an aside, but there was an experiment that was done at that time in the UK, and I guess, no, it wasn't in the 30s, 40s, it was a little bit later on in the 60s, where there was this, I guess at the end of the night on BBC, there would be this one particular tone that would be played at the end of the night, and it would be accompanied by some, like a triangle, kind of in the middle of the screen. Sorry. It was the tone would be played at a particular frequency. They happened to use that tone frequency in their experiments, and it was meant to be associated with this triangle that was being illuminated. You had to detect the triangle, right? Same kind of conditioning idea. Well, people reported calling into the lab afterward when they heard the tone when the BBC went off the air, and saying, "How did you get the triangle on the screen? How did you do that?" Which is really very interesting. So it's a long-lasting kind of context-independent kind of percept that stuck around. So again, it came up in the 60s, 70s, and then in the 80s when people started asking the question like, well, is this actually related to actual hallucinations? Is that actually a thing? And they started being able to do this with folks with hallucinations, and saw some kinds of susceptibilities there, and also did some pharmacological manipulations. But we picked this back up in the mid 2010s to see whether or not this is actually the case in people with hallucinations, and not just people with hallucinations, but people with psychosis. So what we decided to do, if this is really potentially related to the pathophysiology of this symptom in particular, of hallucinations, then what we should really do is try to wash out all the stuff that comes with psychosis otherwise that are not hallucinations, right? And we decided to do that with this 2x2 design, which is to say, and this is a color scheme that will be preserved throughout the talk. So if you think about hallucinations as blue and you think about psychosis as red, then you're going to be safe over the rest of the talk. So if you have both, you have purple, and this is people who have both psychosis, a diagnosable psychotic illness, and daily hallucinations. People who have only a diagnosable psychotic illness are just in red. People who have neither are in white. And people who have just daily hallucinations but no diagnosable psychotic illness, that is in blue. There is, some of you might be like, well, what is that? These are people who are otherwise termed as clinically are non-clinical or healthy voice hearers. These are people who have real seeming hallucinations and yet function quite well and don't have a diagnosable psychotic illness because of that. They're also non-distressing, and there are also all sorts of other kinds of things that go along with that, including a lack of cognitive impairments and other things that make them a pretty good positive control group for this. We can talk about them later on if you'd like as well. So what we did was do something similar to what the Elson and then the Seashore papers did, but in a little more efficient way. Like I said, it was like 19-second long trials, right? And you can't really do that in the scanner, which is what we really wanted to do. And so instead, we kept the kind of basics though, right? Which is like training the visual and auditory association. This is a checkerboard stimulus. People, the visual cortex cares about checkerboards. And so we chose a salient checkerboard stimulus that was paired with an auditory tone that was coincident with the visual stimulus, embedded in white noise. And then the test, of course, was presenting just the visual without the auditory and asking whether or not they perceived the auditory target. We did this in a little bit more efficient way, which was to say we used the QUEST procedure, which is a maximum likelihood-based procedure, where essentially the computer, you kind of feed into it an expectation about where someone's threshold of detection might be, like the point at which they're going to say, yeah, it's there, about 75% of the time. And then it samples around that point in terms of decibels. So in this case, it's dBSNR because it's the loudness of the tone relative to the white noise that was being played. And so you can presuppose a psychometric curve that's a little squish, but it looks like that. And then we can say, we can derive from people's yeses, nos responses the likelihood that they're going to say yes 75% of the time. What's that intensity right there? And then use the rest of the curve to also derive 50% and 25% intensities after that. And then, of course, we also have the zero condition, but of course, you're not estimating that. It's just not there, right? And then what you can do is then present the tones over the course of the experiment in differential frequencies. So this is 12 blocks of 30 trials each. you could start and these are all pseudo-randomized within, they're shuffled within these blocks. And so you start with lots and lots of trials that are presented at individual threshold. It's important to say that this is at threshold, so it's like still hard to hear. It's reliably detected, but it's still pretty hard to hear, right? And then at various sub-threshold frequencies, so this is 50%, 25%, and then increasing likelihood of getting a no-tone trial when it's actually not there. So kind of smoothly over the course of the experiment, you're both creating that association and then testing how they're using that association to inform their answers, right? And so to get at the main finding there, is what we find is that we can look at these trials in which there is nothing there, but they're likely to say, they're going to say that it's actually there or not. So these are false alarms, essentially, in the classical sense. And do the groups differ based upon that? And the answer is yes. So again, the groups that have blue in them, so purple and blue, are the ones with hallucinations. The people that don't have blue in them are the ones without, right? And so when you split that by people with hallucinations and people without hallucinations, there's this main effect of hallucination status. Of note, you'll see, so these are the healthy controls, right? The people without hallucinations but still have a diagnosable psychotic illness and are being treated and have severe delusions and things like that look like the healthy controls on this test. So in this case, if we are interested in, again, the physiology, the pathophysiology of hallucinations in particular, it does seem to be related to that. But again, it might say, okay, well, I mean, that might be true, but like maybe people who hear voices are just kind of used to detecting stuff. Like generally, maybe they're like yesers, like they're saying yes more often than other people are, regardless of what the condition is, right? So this is like just an iceberg effect, essentially. And that doesn't seem to be the case. So if you look at the 75% likelihood condition, this is the threshold condition, did a pretty good job generally, except for the health controls, but they're like just around, clustered around 75%. Again, like scattershot around 50% generally, and they're saying yes about 50% of the time. You start to see groups diverge when incoming sensory evidence becomes more scarce. So at the 25% condition, where it's like, again, very difficult to detect, and then of course the 0 condition, which I showed you before. So that is really where the groups start to kind of differentiate themselves. You might also say, well, I mean, so I didn't mention this, but unlike the other experiments previously, we asked for their confidence too. So when they say yes, how confident are you that it was actually there? Also, if you say no, how confident were you that it wasn't there? So that we can kind of evaluate some metacognitive changes, as we talked about at lunch, right? So we did that. And you could, again, the question is like, okay, well, maybe they're saying yes, but they're hedging their bets. They're like saying yes, but like they're not rating themselves very confidently. We do see the confidence patterns reflecting what you might expect. So as the tone goes up in volume, the yes responses are more confident. As it goes down in volume, the no responses are more confident. So all this stuff seems to pertain, but the main intergroup difference, the only intergroup difference, was between people with and without hallucinations. The people with hallucinations are more likely to be more confident in reporting the presence of the tone, even when it wasn't there, compared to people who didn't have hallucinations. Of course, we did this in the scanner as well, and so we could do something that like the Elsons and the Seashores of the world before us who did this were not able to do, which is a little bit of reverse inference, which is to say, is this really a percept or not, right? And the way we chose to go about that is to take advantage of the fact that I am a pretty anal psychophysicist for the most part, and so when you're doing thresholding and you're trying to do thresholding, you can't threshold them outside the scanner. The scanner is super loud. Like you can't do that. So you got to be scanning them pretty much at the same sequence that you would be during the train and test phase, right? And so that means that we are capturing imaging data during that time as well. And so when the computer is going up and down in tone volume to try to find their threshold, the question is what parts of the brain are going up and down in activity along with that. And what we found is that it's auditory cortex, which is nice, considering again it's a loud environment and it's a quiet stimulus. It was encouraging to see that. So then you can use that as a region of interest, group-wise, and ask a critical question, which is to say, okay, when there's nothing there in these tone-responsive regions, when they say yes versus when they say no, does it look different, right? Does it look like they're actually responding? And the answer is yes. So when they say yes versus when they say no, there's more activity in these tone-responsive regions compared to when they say no, which is encouraging. if you broaden this out to a whole brain view, you see a kind of network of regions that we've seen before, again in the symptom capture realm, when people are pressing buttons when they're hearing voices in the scanner. You see very similar regions pop up. So IFG, anterior insula, a little bit of ACC, which actually didn't show up too much in previous work in thalamus. This is a meta-analysis that done in 2011 of those symptom capture studies. So very similar constellations of regions seem to be active when people report hearing voices in the scanner compared to the conditioned hallucinations or just tones before. Now, of course, it's one thing to be able to say, okay, they're doing this because of expectations, or they're doing this because they're overweighting their expectations more compared to their incoming sensory evidence. And it's another thing to try to actually estimate that. And so what we did is employed the help of our second author here, Chris Mathis, who developed a really robust computational model called the hierarchical Gaussian filter, which is a three-tiered, well, in that case, a two or three-tiered hierarchical model of expectations. And it's pretty much the same kind of hand-wavy model I showed you earlier, right? Which is to say you have beliefs about the world that are kind of maintained or changed over time based upon new evidence. And then those beliefs are kind of weighed against new evidence to determine whether or not you say there's a tone there or not, right? So that same hand-wavy kind of explanation I gave you earlier is built into this model. It's actually two models. It's a perceptual model and it's a response model. Because what we're talking about here is like how much you update your beliefs or use those beliefs then in informing what you're going to say, yes or no, whether the tone's actually there. This is what it looks like. So on a trial-by-trial basis, you have three kind of levels of belief that are being instantiated. So there are certain things you know, right? So it's just like how strong is the sensory input you're giving them, right? So we know that, right? We also know the responses, right? We also can then, from that, estimate a number of different things on a trial-by-trial basis and then kind of parameters over the course of the experiment. The orange ones are the parameters that are derived across the entire experiment. So on the first level, we have on a trial-by-trial basis, how much do I believe that the target tone is actually there, given that the visual stimulus is there? That can then be abstracted up one level, or how much do I believe that, in general, the visual stimulus predicts the auditory stimulus? It's the association strength. And then one level up from that, on the third side of things, is how much do I believe that second level association is changing over time? So that's the volatility belief side of things. And then here is the critical things. There's also inverse decision temperatures, essentially behavioral noise down here. And then the critical one, which is weighting of prior beliefs versus incoming sensory evidence. That's the thing we think is changing and driving people's responding. When you take a look at the actual estimates from these parameters, you see that there's not really all that much different in terms of beta weight, so like inverse decision noise. The thing that was different between those groups, and again, it's split by hallucinators versus not hallucinators, is this weighting of prior beliefs versus incoming sensory evidence, which is essentially indistinguishable. Oops, hello. One more. There you go. Sorry. Is pretty much indistinguishable between these groups at least, and then pretty similar on the non-hallucinating side of things. They also maintain their beliefs in the association between the visual and the auditory stimulus longer over time, so they're not updating their beliefs quite as much as other people did. And interestingly enough, on the third level, which is again the volatility, how much is this association changing? Which of course it is changing by design, right? We're showing fewer and fewer trials that actually are presented at threshold and more non-present trials over the course of the experiment. So we are systematically breaking that association. People with psychosis are less likely to detect that breakage of the association compared to people who did not have a diagnosable psychotic illness. So there's this nice double dissociation there that we got. We can then do interesting things like be able to take those belief trajectories over time and see whether or not they actually correspond to particular regions that we know are involved in developing conditioned hallucinations. So the yellow are the regions that are active when people are saying yes, even when there's nothing there, compared to when they say no. And the nice thing about that is that you see on the X1, this is the low level belief side of things. Those are regions that are, for the most part, encoding high, kind of low-level perceptual beliefs about the world. That's really what the yellow regions are instantiating. And then we also see kind of some regions in the cerebellum and the parahippocampal gyres that seem to be encoding volatility beliefs. And those regions also are differentially active compared to the groups. So they're the X1 beliefs, the like low-level perceptual beliefs, are more likely to cause activation in those regions that are involved in essentially perception in the people who have hallucinations versus people who don't, and that is also true on the psychosis versus non-psychosis distinction. So what the story is then is that hallucinations seem to go along with hyper-precise priors. People are more likely to trust their expectations versus their incoming sensory evidence. But don't just take my word for it. There are a bunch of other people since that time who have said something similar. So this is a paper that was done in 2017 as well in Brain by Ben Alderson-Day and a bunch of other folks, which is actually really an interesting paradigm. It's got some limitations to it, but I think it's really cool. I wish I had brought an auditory demonstration, but I didn't. It's using sign vocoded speech. So you have this, the stimulus sounds like R2D2 speech. It's like, but it actually is, like half of them are actual speech tokens that are being degraded by sign vocoding, and half of them are just nonsense. And given exposure to the previous speech snippets, people with hallucinations are much more likely to detect speech earlier and more accurately compared to people who don't have hallucinations with similar levels of kind of clinical impairment. So again, that's consistent with the idea that they're using their expectations more than other people who didn't have hallucinations. This is a paper from Cliff Cassidy and Guillermo Horga at Columbia in current biology, same year, next year, doing a similar paradigm that we discussed earlier, which is looking at tone reproductions, variable context tone reproduction task, where people will present they'll present a certain length of tone that was like beep, and your job is to replicate that target. So you have to like press a button to make the tone be as long as that one. But the target tone is then preceded by a train of other stimuli. Either they're longer or they're shorter than the target one. And you're very much influenced by that train beforehand. But you're more influenced by that train, either by being repelled or attracted toward the duration, depending on how variable that train is. And the difference between the variability and the non-variable conditions, that predicted hallucination susceptibility generally. So you are more likely to be influenced by your expectations of priors that are instantiated by that train if you have hallucinations compared to if you don't. This is also true in other disease states that have hallucinations. This is the first evidence that people with visual hallucinations and dementia with Lewy bodies might also have this tendency. This is in high contrast images. So this is a situation where you have like kind of blotches on the screen, black and whites, and you kind of can detect like a scene or not, and some are noise and some are not. But given the exposure again to the past scenes, the real scenes, people with the visual hallucinations are more likely to use those priors and detect the reality, the real scenes versus the not real scenes. So there's a performance increment here, which is not often what you see in other experiments. So that is encouraging. And then lastly, this is a down translation of the conditioned hallucinations work that was done by Katerina Schmack and Adam Kepix to mice, showing something very similar. Oh, by the way, the critical things about both of these papers, this paper and this paper, is that not only do they show a tendency toward hyperprecise priors in people with hallucinations, but they also tie it to striatal dopamine synthesis capacity. So it seems like the dorsal striatum's capacity toward synthesis of dopamine seems to critically predict how much you trust your priors and also your tendency toward hallucinations. That's all well and good, of course, but if we're really detecting something fundamental, this is not just kind of like a tendency on a particular task, which is important and could be useful for testing. If we're actually trying to assay a latent state that's driving symptomatology, you would expect that those things you might get at it in multiple different ways. And so what a very talented postgraduate at that time, now an MD PhD student at Penn, Adan Kafadar, did was to see whether or not that was true. So in a bunch of people who are at clinical high risk for psychosis, so very early in the illness stage potentially, she administered both the conditioned hallucinations task and the auditory side of things, and then also the sign vocoded speech stuff, the R2D2 speech experiment that we talked about earlier, to see whether or not people's tendencies toward those effects correlated. And in general, it's this relatively small sample, but what she found is that there is tendency toward these kind of prior related phenomena in both tests in the CHR versus the healthy control samples. And they do tend to correlate, but they tend to correlate even better using the underlying latent state estimates. So this is relative prior precision on the y-axis, and the tendency toward reporting conditioned hallucinations on the x-axis. Of course, they're related because they're essentially derived from the same thing, but it also does predict probability of detecting speech as well. So that same latent state predicts a performance in a separate task, which is what we would think would happen. But how sensitive is this? So, like, in the little secret I didn't tell you about earlier is that some of the folks in the red group that we were talking about before, is the people who have diagnosable psychotic illness, people who have like delusions and other things, but don't currently have hallucinations. They were allowed to have had hallucinations at some point in the past, right? Like, this is like 10 years ago they had hallucinations. But the question is, like, okay, what kind of tendency are we really talking about here? Like, where does this lie in terms of like the actual pathophysiology of hallucinations? Is it a state marker? As in, like, if I currently have hallucinations, am I more likely to have this present, or is it going to be true all my life, right? Like, as soon as I'm born, more likely to trust my priors, and that's going to be that, and I'm destined toward having a higher likelihood of having hallucinations. It gets at, to some degree, kind of where we sit with regard to this particular abnormality and symptom expression. And so the question that Tori Fisher and Adnan Kafadar are together, Tori is now at Columbia working with Guillermo Orga. The question is the state sensitive or not? And so what we did is did this in a large online sample. Some of you at lunch heard that we had this R1 going on in the lab right now looking at voluntary control of hallucinations. So some people could turn them on and off at will. You need a whole lot of people to be able to validate the scale, let me tell you, to be able to tell you whether or not you actually can turn your voices on and off. So what we had to do is develop this huge network of networks of people who have voice hearing across the world. So we have right now 2,800 people enrolled in this particular study. That also means that you can not only ask them about like all sorts of stuff with their hallucinations, but also make them do boring tests like mine while they're doing it. So that's exactly what we did online. And what we found is that people with hallucinations, again, show a tendency toward conditioned hallucinations compared to people who don't have hallucinations. Similar kinds of responses. It actually also appears, we did this analysis here because we had enough people to do it, happens pretty early in the context of the experiment as well. This is like trial 26, I think, is when the significant differences actually start showing up. Peak at around 49, I think, or so. So it's pretty early. That means that we can cut our test down, which is really nice too, because it's long and boring. But the interesting thing about this is we can ask the question, okay, we got a whole bunch of people who have all sorts of different varying like clinical characteristics about them. Some of them are experiencing them very frequently, some are distressed by them, some are not. And what kind of maps onto this tendency is the question, right? And so what we found is that the thing that really predicts performance in the task is current symptom state and symptom severity, so frequency. So there's a stepwise kind of decline in tendency toward hallucinations. Yeah, it starts pretty low with the auditory hallucination negative group, then stepwise goes up when you go from monthly or less to weekly to daily hallucinations. It even goes on beyond that. If you're having nearly constant hallucinations, it's even higher. And then the same thing is true of the confidence metrics, and it also appears earlier in the course of the experiment. When you do the modeling, you see the similar kind of stepwise thing, and that's really where it loads onto, is this tendency toward prior hyper-precision. So what that means essentially, in the critical piece actually as well, is that because we had these people do the experiment initially, and then 6 months later or 12 months later had them come back and do it again because we wanted to see about the changes in their tendency toward hallucinations and voluntary control and how much that changes. We also had them do the experiment again, and so the question is, how much does that change? And when it does change, because people's voice hearing experiences go up and down in frequency all the time because of treatment, but also not. Stress influences quite a lot. So the question is, okay, when they go up and down in voice hearing frequency, do you see these metrics also go up and down? And the answer is yes. So the people who who had their voices go up in frequency had more of a tendency to trust their priors, higher conditional hallucinations rate compared to the people who had fewer over the course of time. So that does indicate, again, that this might be a state-sensitive marker. So then if we're going back to our kind of physiological model, what this really means, I think, is that we have hallucinations and then we have this, relative prior hyperprecision, right? So it's like the bilirubin, potentially, of this, right? So it's like the thing that's just, if you scratch the surface of symptoms, like that is maybe what's underlying many of hallucinations. Not all, but many, right? But that doesn't answer anything about what's under here, right? Like, really, if this is a state-sensitive marker, this is just prior to symptom expression. When you're looking at someone's yellow eyeball, what you're really detecting with your eyes is bilirubin, right? That's what you're doing, right? And so when people are hallucinating, what you're maybe detecting is their tendency to overtrust their priors. That's okay, and it's important. But it doesn't answer the question as to where it comes from, necessarily. And so the thing I've been obsessed with, welcome, is why that might be true, right? And you can give a couple answers to that. One, as I said before, dopamine seems to be important in psychosis. Generally, all of our drugs, except for one now recently, treat psychotic symptoms using dopamine blockade. So we know that has something to do with it. And also from Guillermo's work and from Katerina's work, we think that dopamine synthesis capacity in striatum has something to do with it, right? So that would make some sense as well. But it's also a possibility that what we're seeing is not necessarily a primary derangement of dopaminergic functioning, but rather a secondary effect. So you can imagine I might overtrust my priors, not just because maybe the thing that governs how much I trust my priors is broken, but maybe it's advantageous for me to do so because my incoming sensory evidence, the things that it's being weighted against, is unreliable, that it is itself corrupted, and that there's this upstream deficit in sensory processing that might then cause you to overtrust your priors in a physiological, appropriate way. So we talked about at lunch the medical homologs to that, which would be, or analogs to that, which would be like parathyroid hormones, like hyperparathyroidism, right? You can get way too much way too much parathyroid hormone because your parathyroid is just pumping out too much parathyroid hormone, and like there's an adenoma that's doing that, and that's pretty much the deficit. That's the problem. Or because you have upstream deficits in calcium metabolism that is causing the parathyroid glands to like pump a lot of PTH out, but it's only because of the upstream deficit that's doing that. So the question here is like, is this state-sensitive thing that we're detecting, is it a primary deficit or is it a secondary deficit? And what I'm going to show you from here on out is potential evidence that is for a secondary hallucinogenesis depiction. So this is work actually that does look at not psychosis, but this is dementia with Lewy bodies. I failed to mention earlier. So dementia with Lewy bodies, I don't know if you guys know much about it, is a dementia that is closely related to Parkinson's disease. It shares the same molecular deficit, so it's an alpha-synucleinopathy. It's a derangement in alpha-synuclein. And it shares a prodrome with Parkinson's disease as well. That prodrome, this like prior disease state, is REM sleep behavior disorder. So when you act out your dreams, so within 12 years or so, if you have REM sleep behavior disorder in midlife, you're very likely, 90% likely, to develop either Parkinson's or dementia with Lewy bodies. The initial presentations of Parkinson's and dementia with Lewy bodies are very different as well. So dementia with Lewy bodies presents early on with visuospatial deficits and vivid visual hallucinations. The phenomenology of this is really interesting, actually. So 93% of people with dementia with Lewy bodies will develop visual hallucinations, and they're often very well characterized, very fine-tuned, I guess, very detailed hallucinations. There's a patient that we had who described these church ladies that played cards on every Saturday afternoon at 5 o'clock, and they would describe the outfits and what they were doing, and like very detailed, and not disturbed by them, not distressed by the fact that they were there. They were there. She perceived them, didn't think there were omens of something bad, didn't relate to some kind of delusional framework. They're just very vivid visual hallucinations. And that does happen also in Parkinson's, but much later on. And is often related to kind of iatrogenic things like, I'm giving them dopaminergic medications to help treat the motor side of Parkinson's disease. And so it often is related to those medications in particular. So this is a real kind of pathophysiological difference here, one with hallucinations, one without. And so what Raina's dissertation project is doing, this is a collaboration with Carolyn Fredericks from neurology, is to take a look at the visual version of the conditioned hallucinations task, where we're doing essentially the same thing. This is really pretty much an analog. So we have very salient auditory cues, even the same frequency as the original auditory hallucinations, conditioned hallucinations experiment, and that's tied to a target, which is these Gaussian kind of stripes, right? That are being varied in terms of their contrast. So your job is to detect the stripes being there or not being there. And again, like they're there and paired, and then the question is like, do they, in the stripe absent condition, report stripes being there nonetheless when it's paired with the visual, with the auditory stimulus? This is preliminary data from Raina's dissertation. So again, with dementia with Lewy bodies who have a lot of visual hallucinations, Parkinson's disease who have very few, there's a big difference there. And then people in the prodrome with REM behavior disorder, again, they kind of look, interestingly enough, split between those two, right? So, and we know that some of those folks are heading toward dementia with Lewy bodies and some are heading toward Parkinson's. And so the question is, could you make the prediction that these folks are heading toward dementia with Lewy bodies and these folks are heading toward Parkinson's? We can, and we are making that prediction in the new R01 that just got funded. We are doing that. We're following them over the course of time and seeing what develops over time. We also, let's see. In addition to that, we also see differences in actual symptomatology. So this is a music score, which is a tendency toward visual anomalous percepts. Higher in DLB versus PD, and in the middle, kind of this, again, split. And they correlate nicely enough. So visual conditional hallucinations rates does correlate with this kind of general broad continuous measure of anomalous visual percepts. And a tendency towards seeing faces and noise, interestingly enough, as well. The nice thing about this, too, is that we know that in dementia with Lewy bodies, there are these early deficits that exist, too, in visuospatial processing. The visual-spatial attention, in particular, seems to be impaired. And so we have some imperfect, but still good measures of visuospatial attention. This is a DOTS task. I don't have a depiction of it, but essentially it's like, keep in mind, so you have like a bunch of dots in an array. One of them is red, there's a mask, and then it kind of shows up again. And is the red dot the same red dot, or is it closer or far away? People with dementia with Lewy bodies are not so good at it. It's not a hard task, so you'll see most people are kind of at ceiling here in the PD side of things and the RBD side of things, but there is a deficit that exists in DLB. And that deficit does seem to correlate with a tendency toward visual conditioned hallucinations and also toward a tendency toward anomalous visual percepts. We're doing this in the scanner as well. So this is a contrast of false positives. These are VCH events versus true negatives, the same yes versus no and nothing's there kind of contrast. And we see something very similar, including interinsula activation bilaterally, interestingly enough. And a tendency toward hallucinations does seem to relate to that anterior insula activation as well. In addition to that, so these are kind of evidence for, like, again, hyperprecise priors, where you see true positive versus false alarms. So this is like, how much are you driving the actual visual cortex with something real? And the less you drive the visual cortex, this is the lateral occipital region of interest, and the less you drive those regions with actual visual stimulation, the more likely you are to actually experience visual conditioned hallucinations and also experience these visual anomalous percepts. So again, it ties together this idea that you have these visual kind of, or initial kind of sensory deficits that might be kind of compensated for later on by kind of an overweighting of priors. And temporally, it seems like maybe that potentially makes some sense. And this is also true, by the way, not just in dementia with Lewy bodies and maybe not in dystonia psychosis, but like every hallucinogenesis, every kind of hallucinogenic syndrome we know about tends to follow the same kind of pattern. So things like phantom limb, for example. You get a cut off of your limb. You perceive the limb there because of that deafferentation of input, right? You have cochlear deficits, sensory neural hearing loss. People either have tinnitus oftentimes, which is also a perceptive of tone or buzzing and things like that in the absence of that of input from the cochlea. Again, this kind of top-down filling in given a deficit. Also, musical hallucinations arise during that case. Musical ear syndrome. Charles-Bonnet syndrome is the same way in the visual cortex or the visual system. We have macular degeneration, and that tends to result in percepts or hallucinations of like little people running around. They're Lilliputian characters that exist in macular degeneration. Also, occipital strokes. So this is a conserved theme across the sensory modalities, right? This is not anything new necessarily, but it does seem to be potentially common to most diseases that have hallucinations in them. And so the question is, does that truly apply to psychosis as well? And if so, why, right? Because we know, yeah, there are sensory deficits in psychosis. That's been established, right? But not to the same degree as like a macular degeneration. Like they're not losing their eyesight. They're not cutting off a limb, right? So like what could potentially be the thing that is giving rise to that in the context of psychosis? So we published this paper this last year looking at maybe exactly what that potentially could look like. And it makes some predictions about why that may be the case. It starts with some pretty well established observations in schizophrenia, namely NMDA hypofunction, so glutamatergic dysfunction that happens in psychosis, pretty well established here. Not only that, but with like pharmacological studies like ketamine, where you block NMDA receptors, you tend to see interesting things arise, including new belief formation. People start believing that maybe I'm a bird, I don't know, so like new delusion formation. Very seldom do you actually see hallucinations develop during that time. You do see delusion formation happening during that time, and then it resolves afterward. And doesn't stick around like real delusions do. And it seems to be related to cortical hyperexcitability, so increased EI balance. And then, so if we kind of like talk about this across the kind of levels of description that we like to do, what we see is like NMDA hypofunction, potentially leading to hyperexcitability, increased prediction error signaling, causing new belief formation when it shouldn't. And this is kind of akin to what we were talking about when we first met a little bit, in different phase of the illness, certainly. And then that causes inappropriate learning and then delusion formation, like we talked about the ketamine example. And then, over the course of time, this decreased SNR, this decreased signal-to-noise ratio, essentially could mean that the brain essentially says, like, this is junk. This is not information that's all that reliable. I will essentially compensatorily downweight that information in comparison to my incoming sensory evidence, and so then develop hallucinations, and also solidification of the delusions that you've developed, right? So you've developed these weird beliefs, right? Now they become impervious to new information. So delusion is the fixed false belief. What we're saying here is that the false comes first and the fixed comes later, potentially, right? And so that makes very particular predictions about things. And that includes that if that's true in the natural history of the disorder, right, then you should see certain things happen. In particular, you should see that delusions happen then first, right? If this is incoming noise that's causing you to believe weird stuff, delusions should form first. The weird beliefs should happen first, and then later on you should see solidification of those beliefs and also hallucinations emerge. Now, by the way, this is exactly the opposite of what I was taught in residency, which is that I start believing weird stuff about the world because I'm perceiving weird things about the world. I might believe that the FBI is after me because I hear footsteps, right? That is making the exact opposite. This is making the exact opposite prediction. So the question that is, what happens first, right? So this is work that's done by Catalina Morges and David Benramo in my lab. David has his own lab in McGill now and is doing really well. But the question is, what do you see happen first? And this is from work, by the way, how am I doing on time?
A couple more minutes is fine.
Couple minutes, okay.
Yeah.
So that means I'm over, okay.
We only have 35 minutes total left over, but we would like to ask you some questions.
Okay, yeah, I can totally do that. Okay, that's good. Okay, so I'll finish up. Sorry. So these are data that are coming from the biggest consortia looking at people at clinical high risk for psychosis, so in the putative prodrome to psychosis, and also in a first episode sample that was gathered at McGill. So the question is, what do people show up with when they first show up, right? So at baseline, what we see is, so these are in, again, hallucinations are in blue, delusions here in this case are in red, people with both are in purple. Most people show up both, hallucinations and delusions, but if you look at people with only one symptom of those two, there are way more people with only delusions than only hallucinations in both samples, right? And when you ask them, okay, you have both, what happened first? Like what occurred first? And you look at that, it's more likely that's pretty well more likely that delusions happen first compared to hallucinations retrospectively in that sample. The other cool thing about this is that you can then follow them over time, and you ask about the actual dynamics of those symptoms as they disappear and reemerge and all sorts of other stuff. But first, before we did that, we looked at the first episode sample and the PEP sample, and again, similar situation where way more people retrospectively report delusions happening before hallucinations in the natural history of the illness. And the nice thing that is a kind of, and this is a little bit of a kind of, very specific kind of observation about these data, in these folks, not all of them will develop psychosis, right? They're at high risk for developing psychosis, but not all of them will develop psychosis. So you can kind of ask the question as like whether this is actually true in the true development of psychotic illness. This sample answers that question because all of them have developed psychosis. Retrospectively, what happened first, it seems to be delusions first. You can look at, like I said, dynamics of that. So if you look at kind of noise of expression, if this is a secondary thing, you might imagine that it's the result of two noisy processes. It might be more noisy than a primary, just kind of initial kind of noisy process, one dependent on one process. So if it is the fact that hallucinations are kind of a secondary phenomenon, you might expect them to be more noisy in their expression compared to delusions over the course of that time period when they're being followed. That does seem to be the case if you look at level-ziv complexity as well as the kind of general standard deviation of the scores themselves. Hallucinations are noisier. That is true in the prodrome and not true in first episode. So once you do get to the point where you are reaching full-blown illness, that doesn't seem to be the case, which is really interesting, I think, and tells us a little bit about kind of when hallucinations kind of emerge and when they solidify, which is the line between the prodrome and first episode, is this kind of crystallization of the delusional framework. So that disappears with the first episode. Interestingly enough, when you, like I said, follow people, they have these hallucinations and delusions that emerge, and then some of them go into remission, like they go away. But that gives us the opportunity to say, like, okay, well, when they do, what disappears first, right? And what reemerges first, right? So we cannot just take their word for it. We actually watch it happen over time. And so, interestingly enough, fitting with the secondary hallucinogenesis account, you see hallucinations disappearing first when they go into remission, and you see delusions reemerging first when they come back, which again fits with the framework. This is also an interesting piece that I'm still that I think is still surprising to me, even when I see it. As a clinician, you might expect that if you have delusions, so say I'm suspicious about things, like people maybe are following me, and I start hearing things as well, I might expect that those delusions then would be kind of reinforced by these new percepts potentially, right? And so you might expect that if you peg like delusion, if you look at delusional severity or prodromal delusional severity, and you peg it to the onset of hallucinations, you might see an increase after the hallucinations work, right? After the hallucinations emerge, rather than a decrease, potentially. But if it is a compensatory thing, you might actually expect the opposite. You might expect that potentially, if it is kind of downweighting new information and new kind of surprise responses, you might see the opposite. And we, in fact, see the non-clinically intuitive opposite, where you see a decrease in delusional ideation in both samples in the prodrome. Both Naples 2 and Naples 3 see a significant decrease in delusional severity with the onset of hallucinations, which again doesn't make sense clinically, but might make sense within the context of the computational framework that we have espoused. There's a lot of other stuff that I'm going to skip through, so in favor of in favor of answering questions. This is work by Julia Rodriguez Sanchez, who up until recently was a graduate student with Rick Adams at UCL. She looked at EEG data. I think we talked about this at lunch as well. Looked at EEG data in the P300 task. It's an oddball task, like lots of beeps and a boop. Detect when the boops happen. And it's essentially a marker of surprise, right? If what we're saying is true, then there should be a differential response if you develop hallucinations after you develop delusions, because what we're doing is, again, kind of tamping down that surprise response in the people who have had a secondary response or secondary emergence of hallucinations. And so that's exactly what Julia sees. So if you look at healthy controls, people with delusions only versus delusions first, we have both. There is a specific deficit that happens in people who have delusions first versus people who even just have hallucinations first. So order of symptom onset seems to matter, and it does seem to be a kind of a top-down dampening of the surprise response corresponding to what we think might be an order of events that corresponds to a secondary hallucinogenesis. Skip. Also fMRI, lots more. This is like this is connectivity results, DCM connectivity results, looking at more top-down influence essentially over the course of time when you develop hallucinations versus just delusions. We can get into that later on as well. Lastly, so there's a second R1 that's going on in the lab that is looking at this interesting phenomenon that is super understudied, like criminally understudied, which is that it takes advantage of the fact that not everybody develops psychosis in the typical kind of way, like during adolescence and early adulthood. There's a second peak of incidence of first episode psychosis, and that is during the menopause transition. So the question we had is whether or not the same order of events seems to happen in that particular group of people, which, by the way, nobody knows very much about at all. Like, you don't know, like, if family history matters. You don't know if, like, hey, you had a kid and then afterward you had postpartum symptoms. Does that matter? Do you know if, like, you had premorbid, drug use or mood disorder or anything at all? We don't know very much about it, so we're studying that right now in the lab. We'd also asked interesting questions about the pathophysiology of it and how things actually develop. And it turns out the order of events I talked about earlier with delusion formation first seems to also happen in these women who are undergoing psychosis onset during the menopause transition as well. So again, this seems to be conserved not only kind of across like different phases of illness, but potentially different manifestations of the illness as well during different parts of the lifespan. Let's skip that too. I really overloaded things. And then lastly, this is work that was done by my graduate student, my MD PhD student, Max, who is very interested in psychedelics, because who's not interested in psychedelics now? And the question that he had, though, of interest, was that some people develop hallucinations essentially as response to the exposure to psychedelics. These are flashbacks, right? These are like perceptual persistent HPPD, hallucinogen persistent perceptual disorder. The question is, like, what predisposed you to that? And when you do develop hallucinations that persist, what does that correspond to? And it seems to be, this is a bunch of stuff I'm going to have to skip through, unfortunately. It is a higher tendency toward visual condition hallucinations, general kind of over-trusting of your priors that seems to correspond particularly to the expression of hallucinations after exposure to psychedelics. So it does again seem to reflect the state of having persisting perceptual symptoms after exposure to psychedelics. Does seem to correspond to hyperprecise priors currently as well. Okay, so to conclude, what I've told you right now today is that relatively hyperprecise priors can seemingly drive hallucination-like percepts and does seem to correspond to a tendency toward clinical hallucinations. There's some evidence for secondary hallucinations, hallucinogenesis in both psychosis and other disorders. And in general, we think that generative modeling or understanding latent states that drive symptom expression in general might be a foothold that we can gain into understanding how those symptoms developed in the first place and how to use precision approaches to either prevent them or treat them based upon knowledge of that pathophysiology. Next steps, we need to gather a lot more data. As you know, we're doing some pharmacological manipulations as well. So we're doing some cholinergic manipulation. This fits with the new Cobenfy, the new cholinergic antipsychotic that's been that has been developed and is in use now for the last year or two. You might ask, why cholinergic stuff? Like, what's the story there? Well, there's a good amount of evidence in the computational literature, in particular perception, that cholinergic tone actually encodes the precision of incoming sensory evidence. So if you're looking at stimulation or agonism at the M1 and M4 receptor, which is what Cobenfy does, you might actually see an increase in precision of your incoming sensory evidence relative to your priors. And if it's the ratio that matters, then it should correct the ratio, and it seems to, interestingly enough, when people can tolerate it. The thing I really want to get at here is like altering glutamatergic functioning or early. Because if we think that is the first mover, if we think that is actually the thing that's causing cortical hyperexcitability and delusion formation in the first place, we got to try to manipulate glutamatergic function. So I've been part of the AMP Schizophrenia, the Accelerating Medicines Partnership Schizophrenia Consortium for a while here, and I'm leading the follow-up to that. There's currently ProCan, which is the new clinical trial for new agents to treat in the prodrome. And I think there are some agents that are being considered that are potentially glutamatergic that could be really promising, that could take advantage of what we think is emerging knowledge about the pathophysiology of psychosis here. I'm hopeful about that too. And then we're hoping to actually look at the symptom emergence profiles that exist in these genetic high-risk populations, in particular the 3q29 deletion syndrome. I'm pointing, gesturing over to Jen Muley here, who's here at Rutgers, with whom I put in an R01 just this past cycle, to be able to do exactly that. The gold here, of course, would be to say, all the people I talked about in the earliest phases of the illness so far are in clinical high risk. That means they showed up to us because they already have the beginnings of symptoms, right? The gold would be to find people who are already at risk and then watch symptoms develop over time, right? This is akin to the RBD, the Rem Behavior Disorder Study, where they haven't developed symptoms yet. You can watch them develop symptoms and understand what the contributions of sensory kind of disruption might actually end up being. We can do that with this population. I'm really grateful to be able to work with Jen on that. And then lastly, there's a lot of interesting stuff that could potentially fit into this. For example, we know that the biggest environmental risk factor for developing psychosis is cannabis exposure, and that's only gotten worse recently because of legalization efforts across the country. And so the question is why? Like, that doesn't seem to be true for other drugs. Like, it doesn't have to be true for nicotine or for alcohol or for other psychoactive substances. So like, why should it be that cannabis is doing this? We think that perhaps what it does is, and this is evidence borne out by our collaborator, Jose Cortes-Briones at Yale, who has shown that increased cortical-thalamic connectivity and increased cortical noise essentially seems to be corresponding to THC exposure. So we think that perhaps what it actually is doing is mimicking the earliest phases of delusion formation with cannabis exposure, with THC exposure. So the question what we're trying to do is compare people who are at clinical high risk for psychosis in that early phase to people who have exposure to THC and seeing whether or not that mimicry is actually really happening. We're doing this in the MEG at Yale, so we can actually measure that pretty precisely. So that is another future direction. And then lastly, I just wanted to thank you all for your attention, and also for all the people of the Big Happy family. And this is the holiday party. There are a lot of people at the holiday party. So it's not just my lab, but also their friends and family and the Prime Clinic and everybody else. But thank you as well to the Center for Cognitive Sciences, particularly Pernilla, for having me down here. It's been a real privilege, and I thank you for your attention. Yeah.
So this is super interesting, and I love the story about sort of trapped priors. But there's something you said towards the end, talk about macular degeneration, having hallucinations and things like Lilliputians.
Yeah.
And I just can't stop thinking about what prior would lead a person to hallucinate something like that, and not something like rats or birds. Or something that you have evidence of.
Floating faces or whatever. Like, the visual cortex is attuned to.
But it seems to be kind of a theme in a lot of these hallucinations. Something that seems very implausible. So I'm curious about the prior story. What kinds of priors?
That's a really good question. I mean, yes and no, right? So like the auditory system, if it's attuned to anything, it's the fundamental frequency of the human voice, right? And so in that case, I would say like, okay, that's like probably the most ecologically valid thing you could possibly detect. But like Lilliputian characters, I don't know. Like, why little people necessarily? And people do like there's noise pareidolia that happens early on in like I said, in dimensional Lewy bodies, where like people are likely to see faces and noise, which of course we all do. And again, the visual cortex is, the visual system in general is attuned to anything. It's probably face detection. But I don't know. That's a really good question. I don't know why you would want to detect little people. Well, I would, but
they were originally carriages, and then they became cars.
what's that?
They were originally modes of transportation.
Oh.
People driving carriages and stuff. And now folks with Charlemagne they tend to hallucinate vehicles like cars and trucks.
Oh, there you go. Okay, so that's interesting. So maybe I overstated the frequency of that particular phenomenology, phenomenological aspect. Yeah.
On that note, I'm interested in how you think these certain like genres of hallucinations, where you see these very similar phenomenological experiences in specific disorders, develop. If that is something about the kind of degeneration or damage that is happening, or if it is something else.
Yeah. So I guess the question is like, how much does the upstream disruption predict the phenomenology of the thing that is going to eventually develop? It's a good question. I am, and I guess it's similar to yours as well. I guess why the particular flavors of hallucinations. You might ask that also again about the voice situation as opposed to, anything else. I don't know if we know enough necessarily to say that right now. It's really unsatisfactory. I hate that I had to say that, but I don't think we do.
Me?
Yeah, you.
So you said that false beliefs come first and then that becomes fixed. And so I was wondering how, when you were talking about there's more tendency to overtrust priors, how is this advantageous, or how can this become advantageous? Is it through like medication? Because I was thinking like, oh, if it was the opposite, like it's fixed and then false, like you're hearing footsteps and then you think it's the FBI, wouldn't that cause you to overtrust priors versus if it's the false beliefs first?
Yeah.
So you think that the FBI is chasing you, so then you hear footsteps. Wouldn't that indicate that there's less tendency to overtrust priors due to like paranoia?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. So like this is kind of a little bit overstated to some degree in terms of this like, okay, there's this thing and then there's a compensation against it. In reality, this is this like iterative process, right? So like when people start hearing things, right, it's often not voices, for example, right? It's often buzzes or mumbles or static, and they can't necessarily make out the content of them, for example. So the way the symptoms really evolve over time, which is over the course of like 22 months, they'll hear these initial disruptions and then kind of like focus upon them, and they develop beliefs about them, and kind of iteratively eventually becomes, I'm hearing the voice of the devil, right? And it's telling me very specific things, right? But the way I've stated it here is a little bit oversimplified in the fact there's this iterative kind of positive feedback loop of beliefs and percepts, and those beliefs also kind of circularly enforce the percepts, and vice versa. And so those things, we should take into account the evolution of the symptoms themselves as well.
You mentioned at one point, phantom limb and those kinds of not necessarily visual or auditory hallucinations, but actual like physical sensory hallucinations. And I was wondering if anyone has thought about doing this kind of research on those sorts of hallucinations rather than visual and auditory.
Yes, there's a manuscript in my inbox that needs to be reviewed by a collaborator at University College London who is doing exactly that. So they adapted the conditioned hallucinations paradigm to tactile hallucinations as well, and it seems to work. People have also done this in terms of interoception, which is really, I think, very interesting. So Ryan Smith at LIBOR at the Laureate Institute for Brain Research, and Saib Khalsa, who's now at UCLA, does really interesting two different paradigms. One, Ryan did this thing with resistance to breathing and detection of like a resistance in like the airway, and like as a measure of interoception, and to be able to kind of see if people with not hallucinations but with kind of anxiety and panic might have something like that, where they're kind of like over trusting the incoming, their kind of expectations about some difficulty, essentially coming from their physiology. and is showing some positive results on that. They also had an interesting vibrating capsule study to try to get at exactly the same thing, where you're trying to detect the vibration of a capsule as it goes through your GI tract. Results are inconclusive at the moment on that, but it was a pretty cool study. So, but yeah, we're trying to kind of bring it across a bunch of different contexts as well. I think David's had his hand up.
So some people look at psychotic-like experiences
Yeah.
on a continuum where you could get from hallucinations down into more illusory experiences, hearing voices in the wind.
Yeah, totally.
So that, any thoughts on whether that's the same process, or is there a level categorical distinction at the point where you're actually hitting hallucination?
That's a great question. It's like whether or not the process itself is similar in terms of development. I don't know if anyone's really looked at the emergence of schizotypy in the same way that we're talking about. The evidence that people have shown is that you can think about the people who are healthy voice hearers and other folks like it in a similar kind of context where they're kind of on the psychosis spectrum but not functioning poorly, and they don't have the other stuff too. And all the indication from our lab and also from the Ben Alderson Day work and a few, it seems to be that they're on a continuum, and that's not a categorical difference. But I think the jury's still out in terms of its actual development. I'm not sure we know.
Yeah, two questions. So first of all, I want to push back a little bit on the notion of hyper-precise. Because
Yeah.
in the R2D2 test, sure, their accuracy was higher, but I mean, surely in general this is not going to be more precise, it's just over-activation, correct?
I think that's right. Yeah, this is why I wanted to make the distinction between whether or not the information is good versus whether it is overweighted. So precision in this case is just the inverse variance of the Gaussian. And it was initially conceptualized as being like literally reliability, like how variable is that information. But I don't know if any evidence that necessarily ties those things concretely together. The weighting of it, that is, versus the actual informational content of the incoming evidence. I think it's a really important mechanistic distinction to make, and one that hasn't really been tested satisfactorily.
And then my second question, so people with hallucinations, what if you teach them a new task for which they have no prior?
Yeah, I mean, that does that. I mean, I think that association, they didn't come in associating checkerboards and tones, right? But you do teach it, right? And then ask like how much they use it. That kind of washes it out. But there are other situations in which they might have a prior that exists already. And the question is like, are they more or less impervious to new information than other people, right? There's a student of mine who's very talented she's created a melody-based version of the CH task where you use melodic trains to produce expectations about what's going to come next. And the cool thing about that is that you can you can teach new melodies and like whatever they're derived from like established hymns in the Western kind of canon. But you can also use ones that are really overlearned. So like Happy Birthday or like whatever. And so you can then kind of ask the question is like, are they easier or less easy to like condition the new ones versus the old ones, and how much are they likely to hear the one versus the other? And the nice thing about that too is that like that source of expectation exists in terms of the melodic train, but then also you're conditioning them at the same time with the visual. So then the question is like that association versus pre-learned kind of or overlearned associations from the train preceding, and what's the balance there per individual, and how does that relate to symptomatology? We don't have results on it yet, but yeah.
And so I'm going to try and relate this back to memory because I don't know if that's what I do, but so my argument in memory is that it's some mixture of episodic and semantic memory, so semantic memory being priors.
Yeah.
And that is a good thing. That's the optimal solution to the memory problem. I don't rely on the very difficult episodic information that's often sparse and unreliable and so on. So it is actually an optimal strategy for the system to rely on priors, and the better those priors are, the more we rely on them. So I always make this car key example, right? Like you have a favorite place in your house, when you come home, you put your car keys there. It's automatic, you walk in the door, you put them there, and the next day, when you are leaving your house, you don't stop and think to yourself, let me episodically retrieve where I put my car keys yesterday.
No, you automatically
You
go.
walk to your
Yeah.
default location.
Yeah.
And only if the car keys are not there do you get annoyed with yourself, because now you have to do this slow, tedious, brain-intensive thing where you have to episodically retrieve the location
Yep.
of your car keys. So our default position is to go with our priors.
Sure.
It's fast and it's efficient. And if the environment works, it's optimal, right?
Sure.
It works for us accurately most of the time. So when you train people on tones, and if those tones are predictable, the system using that information is not necessarily a bad thing,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, it should be what the system should do.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, so
Yeah.
what you're talking about really is like the movement ventral to dorsal and like cortical thalamus striatal kind of loops, right? Like kind of moving from like reward-based kind of activity or planning to like automatic
Yes.
kind of habit-based
Right.
functioning, which is both disrupted in schizophrenia and also adaptive.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know about nuances and but I guess so based on that framework, like, would you then like hypothesize that if you are getting like that, the system would also compensate in the same way, like
Hmm.
we're exposed to those benefits, like we get more people who develop psychosis because like the brain learns that it can't understand information.
Just to restate the question and make sure I understand it, are you saying that if more people are exposed to kind of unreliable new information, would that kind of predispose generally to kind of like to psychosis development overall? Yeah, and you can hand wave yourself into some trouble with that, which I'm about to do. But like as information, say false information in general becomes more plentiful in the news media or not news media or social media landscape or other kinds of source of information that were generally reliable, if there's a lot more noise in that, people tend to trust their expectations or their preconceived beliefs maybe a little bit more. And is that psychosis? I'm not saying that, but I am saying that that same process of like understanding whether to trust new information or update my beliefs might be impacted, yes, generally by the level of environmental noise and reliability of new information. Those things might be causally related, yeah.
So sort of a follow-up to David's question about illusions. So your citation of the Seaborn study back in 1895, the conditioned hallucination study, put me in mind. Just a few years before was the first report that you could induce a perception of a smell by labeling it. You could change people's perceptions very robustly just by saying this is something different, and then they experience it that way.
Right.
And I think a lot about sort of top-down connectivity and mammalian sensory systems and sort of perceptual expectation loops.
Yeah.
So I wonder if your model here has some suggestions about how the overweighting of priors might actually manifest at the sensory level, maybe as a mechanism. It's changing the filters on the input.
Totally. That's a really interesting question. There has been some work done by Peter Koch and others in England looking at high-resolution 7T fMRI and looking at cortical layers and positing that essentially you have different cortical layers that are corresponding to incoming information and also kind of top-down kind of feedback loops-ish. Yeah. But essentially what they show in their findings is visual related, not in clinical populations at all. But essentially their idea is that what's happening is that you have this top-down kind of laying down of a template upon which you have imposition upon noise essentially. That's kind of how it works, is that you have this like expectation that's kind of playing upon noise that exists. And so that would work with anything practically that instantiates an expectation, right? I'm thinking about like Charles Spence's work on sommeliers and like putting red dye in white wine.
And they actually have the person.
Yeah, they actually have the perception. They're not lying. They're not being like, charlatans. They are literally detecting, berry notes and earthy notes and tar notes or whatever, despite the fact that
Rocker's cognitive science club.
Does it? Oh, right. I want to hear about the experiment with the chicken wings as well today. But but yeah, I think that's probably just a theme of how sensory systems, perceptual systems operate with regard to beliefs and new evidence.
I'm really kind of interested in like that melody-based paradigm
Yeah.
that you mentioned. Does that sort of have anything to do with like primary retention, where like for example like to be able to like construe a melody, you have to have an impression of like the segment that you just heard.
Yeah.
So is that sort of like for people who experience hallucinations? Is that sort of like testing for like a predictive deficit for like the melody that's going to come and how it's construed? And I also know that a lot of people who take ketamine and like other drugs, they tend to like improvisational music. So what I find kind of interesting about that is that's kind of like spontaneity within limitations. So there's like a motif, but there's also still that level of like unpredictability and sort of like feeding back into like a general theme.
Yeah.
So like what's like the melody-based paradigm?
Yeah. So right. How does that play into it? I mean, I think this whole, in general, if I can abstract out from that, this general interplay between expectation and new information, like it plays in stories and narratives and music and pretty much everything that we do in terms of understanding our world, and is interestingly intimately related to pleasure as well. So like if I am tasting a wine and I don't expect to have the tarry notes or whatever,
Right.
even though necessarily, whatever, I don't care about tarry notes, is not necessarily inherently pleasurable. That surprise itself is sometimes, very, very pleasurable. The same thing is with an unexpected turn of melody in music as well. And so, like, the interplay between pleasure and reward and these kinds of updating procedures is also very interesting and underexplored.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your great talk. So there, I asked a lot before the talk, so there, I think there are different questions I asked.
Sure.
So there, when we use ChatGPT also has there a lot of hallucinations.
Yeah,
so
right.
Do you all believe the large language model generate some hallucinations, or misunderstand the real information to the much different things? So do you believe there is some common feature to generate the patient hallucination
and GPT related hallucinations? I'm not sure that's true, and I'm not sure I believe that hallucinations are really the correct term for GPT hallucinations. I think they're more akin to delusions, probably, but like they're confabulations. That's right. Because it's like an input that would make sense, but doesn't necessarily reflect reality. So yeah, it's a confabulation. That's exactly right. But there is a relationship between psychotic susceptibility and use of AI, and that fits within the general themes we've been talking about as well, where you have reliability of in terms of beliefs about the world, and oftentimes in normal social interactions those beliefs might be challenged or might be otherwise not strengthened at the very least. But it seems like at least recently people have had interactions with kind of overly effusively sycophantic AI to strengthen beliefs that are somewhat unusual and maybe malfunctional, and seemingly have led to development of psychosis, or at least of delusions in those cases. So the same principle essentially pertains, like, how do I think about the reliability of my existing beliefs versus new information, and the content of that new information, how reliable that is, really matters. And interacting with an AI was like, yes, you're totally right. The Earth is flat, or whatever. That is likely to sustain that belief, and not, at least not challenge it. And you might take that information into account and make it again kind of delusion-like in terms of its imperviousness to new evidence.
So on that note, so there's going to be a reception over in the Center for Cognitive Science, so all the way down to the other end of the building, and if you're familiar with the playroom, we can continue the discussion here, and thank you again to Al.
Cool. Thanks, guys.